Well, Mr. Chairman, first of all, I'm sure Adrian would concur with the view that we're very pleased to be here, very gratified to be here. It's very nice to be invited. Neither of us is a stranger to these premises, and I think not only we personally, but the Church of Ireland has gained immeasurably from its membership of the Institute. It's an amazing phenomenon, really, the programme of meetings and the publications, and we have gained greatly and have been able to bring material from here to other places, which I think has always created quite an impression. I've just come back, as you said, from Lyon, where I was attending an assembly of a body called the Conference of European Churches, CEC, as it's known, CEC or KEK, depending on your language. It describes itself as an association of Orthodox, Protestant, Anglican, Old Catholic and independent churches, about 130 in all, and was founded about 50 years ago to promote ecumenism among the member churches and to provide them with a common voice. The distinction between Anglican and Protestant, which sounds rather strange to some Irish ears, is very clear on continental Europe. And it's worth mentioning, I think, that our sister church, the Church of England, is one of the major players with the EKD, for example, in CEC. It sent a delegation of 10, led by the Bishop of London, to the assembly that I was attending. And the Church of England is among the biggest financial contributors with the German churches to CEC, as is the Church of Scotland. And at least at leadership level, the British churches don't exhibit the Euroscepticism that we've come to associate with the neighbouring island. From the start, CEC made every effort to include the churches on both sides of the Iron Curtain and managed to secure their involvement in meetings and discussions by, as they would admit now, a very judicious use of the word peace to describe the regular encounters east-west. And with the fall of the Soviet Empire, the churches from Central and Eastern Europe have been fully involved, though some of them have very limited resources. The project for European integration that has developed into the EU, which is practically the same age as the Conference of European Churches, greatly impacts on the context in which CEC works. For many years, the churches that comprise CEC had worked together ecumenically in a body known with a rather cumbersome title of European Ecumenical Commission for Church and Society, with a dreadful acronym, EECS, that's what it is known as. And you never said that if you could have possibly avoided it. And this body came in time under the aegis of CEC as a commission for church and society, whose primary purpose is to engage with the institutions of the European Union in much the same way as COMECE does, the Conference of European Catholic Bishops' Conferences. Both bodies, CEC and COMECE, work closely together, and I should indeed say that the Church of Ireland's membership of CEC greatly benefited from the fact that the Secretary-General of COMECE for so long was Monsignor Noel Traynor, now Bishop Noel Traynor in Down and Connor. He helped us in many ways and came to quite a number of our meetings in Dublin. However, while some comparison can be made between CEC and COMECE, the contrast is very considerable. And those of you who are experienced in international affairs would feel totally at home, I think, at a CEC assembly, which is not only ethnically but theologically diverse. A great deal of argument, a great deal of horse trading. There is no Vatican. And this diversity does, of course, to some extent reflect the diversity of European cultures. And it's especially important that CEC is not just a pan-Protestant body. A really significant influence is exercised by the Orthodox churches. Now, a problem has arisen of late where the Russian Orthodox Church is concerned, and its representatives weren't with us at Lyon. But there's a great desire on both sides to heal this breach, which I think I'm correct in saying is of procedural rather than theological or ideological making. The Greek Orthodox Church was with us, as was the Romanian, and not only was the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople represented, but the Ecumenical Patriarch himself the primus inter pares of the Orthodox world addressed us, and in fact created a considerable stir by calling on the Roman Catholic Church, through the Cardinal Archbishop of Lyon, who was present, to join Keck. In a sense, we all thought afterwards, the ecumenical patriarch was uniquely placed to make such a gesture, and his call will have created, I think, not a little interest in Rome. Which brings me to the matter of Christian values. I hope the picture I've outlined so far provides some clue as to the complexity of the concept of values, which can too easily trip off the tongue, and of which Canon Empey will say more particularly about its complexity. The very presence of the Orthodox among the member churches of Keck provides us from the West with a salutary reminder that there is not necessarily unanimity as to how these values are to be interpreted. And this is especially so where the matter of human rights is concerned. Everyone knows that within the Anglican Communion at the moment there is deep division, particularly on matters of sexuality. And a similar conflict of opinion is facing the Church of Scotland, which, as you know, is Presbyterian. A meeting of Keck's Commission of Church and Society, the body that had formerly be called EECS and then came in with Keck, was held some years ago in Moscow. And there it was made manifest the grave reservations that many of the Orthodox harbour as to what some in the West have come to call the liberal agenda. But at least Keck does provide a forum, and not all is dissent. A common bond is baptism, called by some the ecumenical sacrament, and which is now the subject of intense study in Europe, and I gather will soon receive similar attention from the Irish churches. There's also a document called the Carta Ecumenica, this book here. This provides guidelines for the growing cooperation among the churches in Europe, and it's an agreed document between Keck and Commissaire, in other words, all Christians of Europe. And rather like the EU's Charter of Fundamental Rights, it describes fundamental ecumenical responsibilities, from which follow a number of guidelines and commitments, asserting a common belief in one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and dedicating itself to doing the utmost to overcome the problems and obstacles that still divide the churches. Perhaps I might be allowed just to give an example of a recent initiative by Keck's Church and Society Commission. We met in Mechelen, if that's how you pronounce it, and Brussels at the end of April to consider the current time of economic uncertainty. And following meetings with members of the Parliament, the Presidency and the Commission, we wrote to the presidents of these institutions about our concerns that the current crisis was more profound than the analysis of the EU institutions had so far suggested. And our letter went so far as to state that the crisis called into question a number of assumptions that have underpinned EU economic policies over the last decade, such as deregulation, the primacy of economic criteria in all areas of life, as well as an overemphasis on profit and growth. We put it to the leaders of the EU that the crisis had an ethical dimension and that our society was suffering from a lifestyle that focused on individual profit, consumption and greed, rather than taking responsibility for the common good. It maybe was a little bit unfair, I don't know. We made the point that we were concerned that the measures taken by the EU and its member states so far, rather than solving the problem, simply dealt with the symptoms. To quote again from the letter, the European churches understand this crisis as a call for change. Coming back to business as usual will not solve it. Though, that was the end of the quote, we can't avoid the fact, a dilemma actually for many, many churches, that the churches themselves, for instance, through such things as pension funds, are deeply implicated in aspects of capitalism. In Church of Ireland House, you're as likely to find them reading the Financial Times as the Church Times, in fact, probably more likely. The response to the letter that came from Commissioner Vladimir Spidla set out, as you'd expect, the remedial measures that the EU is putting in place, such as the €19 billion from the European Social Fund to support victims of the crisis, and the establishment of a new microcredit facility for employment and social inclusion. But he also acknowledged that response to the crisis must include the structural reforms called for by globalization, demographic ageing, and climate change. And I think this dialogue is only just beginning. And it was noticeable, especially to what you might call the old EU hands who were with us in Brussels, that we were listened to in a rather more intense way than had been the case before. There seems to be, in fact, a searching for answers, a searching for responses, and we found this very encouraging. And just one final thought, rather different one. Some decades ago, there was a strong demand in some quarters that what we have come to call religious education in schools should make way for a place on the school timetable designated moral education. I don't think the Christian churches were ever convinced that this would have been a good idea for several reasons. But an important one was that many teachers recognised that the most powerful way to promote Christian values was to live them, and that the way in which you organised a school, the way in which you treated pupils and teachers, and indeed the way in which you dealt with human problems was the most potent instrument for moral education. And the Carta Ecumenica, which I just mentioned, lays down how the churches should behave towards one another and the world. And it's by practicing the values that we profess that we can best persuade Europe of their importance.
Thank you. It's an interesting insight into those discussions, and particularly the point about the contact with the institutions, which of course is laid down in the Lisbon Treaty as one of the major parts of building the European democratic society and dialogue. So that's really important. Canon Empey, would you like to make your contribution?
Thank you, Tony. Well, I'm going to talk about what has been happening in the Church of Ireland and also some of my thoughts on the subject of Christian values. Both Ken and I belong to the working group on Europe, which is a subcommittee of Church and Society in the Church of Ireland. We report to General Synod on European affairs, and specifically, really, the European Union, and that's our function. I'd like to say, too, that simply I am retired now. I was principal of the Church of Ireland Theological College, but I hasten to say that I'm no theologian. I am, in fact, a medieval historian, with a specialty in Anglo-Norman Ireland. And I began my career, indeed, as a lecturer in a university in the United States. And I'm still engaged actively in research and writing in that field. So I'd just like to put down that marker. I am also a passionate advocate of the European enterprise, partly because of my historical perspectives on Ireland and in Europe, but primarily because I believe that from the days of the coal and steel community, it offers the world, as well as Europe, a radically new method of doing politics, which makes room for reflection on issues of sovereignty and realpolitik that could not have occurred even to Machiavelli or indeed the peerless Thucydides. The working group, I'll just simply say a little bit about that. There'll be more details. This stuff will, I think, go on the website. But we did, of course, become involved in the late lamented referendum on Lisbon. And we met with other representatives of the Roman Catholic, Presbyterian and Methodist churches in Ireland to discuss what we should say about it before the referendum. And we did, in fact, release a press statement on that, which I think will go into this package that will go on the website. But basically, we pointed out, we need to be very careful because you can't tell people how to vote. And that could be very counterproductive, particularly in a community as diverse as the Church of Ireland. But we did welcome, obviously, we recalled the great achievements of the Union. We welcomed the enlargement of the Union. We welcomed the Union's role in relation to things like climate change and energy and third world development. And we urged our respective churches to vote only on those issues that were linked to the treaty, and not, of course, on a lot of the red herrings that were floating around. And we also commended Article 2, Section 20 of the treaty, which recognized the role of churches and religious associations within the Union. May I say that we took a very pragmatic view of that whole sort of rhetorical debate about Christianity going into the Constitution, all that stuff. And we took a very pragmatic view because we realized that behind that there were issues, political issues in continental Europe, particularly Francophone hang-ups about laïcité. So we didn't get bothered about that, but we did think that that provision marked very real progress, and we welcomed it very, very warmly. Now, I think I'll say something in a little bit more detail about Archbishop Martin's address, and then we'll address Christian values. I found the Archbishop's address characteristically robust, forthright, lucid, and to the point. Indeed, to quote Buffon, is it? Le style, c'est l'homme. I liked his no-nonsense approach to how Christians should engage both with the institutions of the Union and with wider moral, social, moral, and philosophical issues. Most, if not all, of these issues were either integral to Western culture as a whole, or they were actually homegrown or self-inflicted. Whatever its imperfections, he fully acknowledged the great merits of the Union. He showed no sympathy for groups that deliberately misrepresented the issues in the late lamented referendum. Indeed, he went further by urging the Union not to turn in on itself, but to work to build, and I quote, a more just and fraternal world. And I would interject here that there is a significant overlap in the interests of the churches and the Union in all these development issues for understandable historical reasons. Obviously, the Union is very involved in what would have been former European colonies, and of course those are precisely the areas with which the churches are connected in many, many different ways, in development programs, in education programs, and so on. And that would be true even at parish level. You can go into a parish church and you'll see parochial involvement, above all in Africa, but the Church of Ireland has connections obviously all over the world, with North America and Australia, the southern countries, and Africa and India and so on, and more recently indeed in China. So in short, there is nothing in the Archbishop's address that I would not be prepared to endorse, and to endorse happily. Anyway, I thought I'd say a little bit more about Christian values, because they were rather assumed, I think, rather than dealt with in the Archbishop's address. What are these Christian values, and how do they apply? And as a historian, I am keenly aware that of the many occasions in European history that church-state relations ended in tears and enduring bitterness. One does not have to go back as far as the investiture contest that racked Europe in the 12th century. One thinks of the French Revolution and the strong traditions of anti-clericism that developed in Europe since the Enlightenment, and which underlie the issues connected with laïcité that I've just already mentioned. We have no shortage of examples in Ireland of how comfortable understandings between church and state likewise ended in tears, whether we are looking at the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland in the 19th century, or at our present troubles in regard to the scandals in schools, in which the state is in some sense responsible and complicit. It is difficult, I think, not to recall Acton's axiom that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and to say that nowhere is this more demonstrably true than within the structures of the church itself. But it doesn't even end there, because the tragedy is that even good people can make an extraordinary mess of things with the best intentions in the world. And looking at the brief record, the brief history of this state, how many times the use of law to police morals ran aground? Whether we are talking about censorship, contraception, divorce, or abortion, the incredible mess of the X case. It was entirely self-inflicted. And so Irish solutions to Irish problems have never been notably successful, and that's just plain reality. Well, does this mean that Christian values ought to come with a health warning? I think the honest answer must be both yes and no. There is no doubt that the scriptures provide abundant reflection on issues of conduct and character. But that is not to say that the Bible is a ready reference book for quick fix moral issues. You cannot abstract ethical answers by checking out the index. Such a fundamentalist approach produces people who want to stone women who have been raped, or mindless creationism in the face of the massive scientific evidence in support of the evolutionary model. And without doubt, Christians have to respond to the call of God in such a way that their lives are to be worthy of, or fitting to, the gospel they proclaim. While the community memory preserved in the great diversity of the scriptures will help to inform ethical debate, it does not supply timeless truths. We can, for instance, get a vivid picture in the letters of St. Paul of the moral struggles of fledgling Christian communities engaged in a dialectical struggle between their Jewish heritage and the values of the Greek communities in which they subsisted. So they had no certain answers, and neither did Paul, as he struggled to deal with all sorts of issues. The truth of the matter is that Christians have no monopoly on moral discourse in a world where rapid change will constantly change the context of moral choice itself. Certainly we have a rich tradition of moral reflection to bring to bear on such questions, but that must be balanced by intellectual openness and moral humility in the face of perplexity. And so bland pontification about Christian values, even when not linked to right-wing politics, must be tempered by the admission that not only do the churches disagree with each other on moral issues, but they are sometimes not even agreed within their own traditions. And here, in all humility, I must refer, as Ken has done, to the bitter debate about homosexual issues within my own communion of churches. I would also say that moral positions change and mutate, just like all life forms. The church, for many centuries, and that includes the New Testament church, or churches, accepted slavery as an institution without any qualms about it. I can't say how far European culture has been shaped by Christian values, but it would be naive to pretend that such values have played no part in the shaping of a distinctive Western culture. We are all heirs to an astonishingly rich and fertile civilization with a bewildering variety of component elements: classical, religious, humanist, scientific, legal, literary, artistic. The list is inexhaustible. And it is important to recognize that among those religious traditions that made significant contributions to this cultural cocktail, we must include Judaism and Islam. I mean, can one imagine the science and the musical heritage, scientific and musical heritage of the West if you excluded the Jewish tradition? And indeed, as far as Islam is concerned, it provided a vital link in the Middle Ages in reacquainting Western Europeans with Aristotle, among many other things too. So, and to say nothing about the Arabic numeral system. And so there is so much ambiguity in this matter should not be cause for despair, but for rejoicing. I mean, how can being human be ever be other than living with ambiguity? I will leave you with an image. Can we have Santa Pudenziana there? I will leave you with an image that to me sums up the ambiguous relationship between church and society that lies at the heart of European culture. Every time I go to Rome, I visit the wonderful apsidal mosaic in the church of Santa Pudenziana, which shows there, as you can see, Christ seated on an imperial throne. It's stacked with gold and gems and very far called, should we say, from the nativity scene. And you see Christ there sitting as an emperor. You see the nimbus there at his head, and that's, of course, an imperial symbol, so that there is no missing the message of this mosaic. And on his left and right, he's flanked by the apostles. Well, two of them have vanished in a 19th century restoration. We'll say no more about that. But the interesting thing about the apostles is, of course, they're addressed as senators because they're wearing the stole, which is, of course, the senatorial garment. And then if you look at the background there, at the top of it, well, the cross seems to be a reference certainly to Jerusalem, of course. It is the heavenly Jerusalem, but it's interesting to look at the buildings in the heavenly Jerusalem. They all look very distinctively Roman. And what I'm saying here is that this is the earliest mosaic in the Basilica in Rome. And it is quite astonishing. It's dated around about 390 AD. And I think if you cast back, remember that there would have been people worshipping in that church, looking at that mosaic in 390, whose parents had suffered under the terrible and the most devastating of all Roman persecutions of the church by Diocletian. So this extraordinary sort of volte-face, whereby in Rome the church and Christian society is re-envisaged as a Roman Empire. And the two roles are completely fused. And that, of course, goes on to, was very deeply embedded in Byzantine civilization, of course, which survived much longer than the Western Empire. And to say that, this marriage of Roman culture and the church, has very profound implications for European civilization. It's notable that as the Western Empire disintegrated not long after this, in the course of the next 2 centuries, the Christians, faced with the inroads of barbarians and the disintegration of the old Mediterranean civilization, they use the word Romanitas because they saw themselves as the heirs to the old classical heritage, which had become so suffused in Christian culture. And I think that that's absolutely critical to remember that. And I think I'm correct in saying that the earliest, but no classical Latin manuscript is earlier than the 9th century. We owe the preservation of what we have left of it to those busy people in Carolingian scriptoria. And so the point really is that even as the empire collapses, it expands, the Romanitas expands. And so that by end of the 4th century, certainly into the 5th century, it is re-exported to Ireland, not at the point of a legionary sword, but in the form of missionary activity. And so really that whole sort of Constantinian church-state thing, took endless ages to resolve itself. I don't think it ever has been fully resolved. You can say the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland is an aspect of it, and the French Revolution and so on. But I just simply, as a historian, say that when I'm trying to put a kind of picture or some kind of stamp or image on what it is that I see in this discussion of Christian values and the European Union. I'm sorry if I ended up giving a history lecture. I didn't mean to do that, but it just happens.
Yes. Thank you so much.